Well, we are looking at Genesis chapter 41 this morning, and a good chunk of the chapter there. So I would invite you to open your Bibles as we walk through this together. I am going to trim a little bit in the middle between verses 16 and 29. Just there's some repetition there, and just for the sake of time, I'm going to condense things a little bit. But, open your Bibles, check up on me, make sure that I'm not leaving out anything important. But we have, if you remember from the last time that we were together, we had, Joseph had been in prison. He had interpreted the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker. The cupbearer had been restored to Pharaoh's service, and we're told he forgot about Joseph and his promise to him. Then we pick it up at the beginning of Genesis 41. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh. "But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Skipping down a few verses, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. May God add his blessing to this word. Over the past several weeks, we've been looking at some of the challenges to living faithfully when we face adversity. Because it's hard to be faithful to God when we're dealing with an imperfect family or a difficult history. And it's hard to be faithful when life falls apart, when we face temptation, when we deal with discouragement. So we might think the answer is just to get rid of adversity, right? You know, if we find prosperity, things will be easier. And King Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, he knew something about prosperity. A feast is made for laughter, wine makes life merry, and money is the answer for everything. But what is the constant refrain of the book of Ecclesiastes? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. We can think that prosperity is going to fix everything, but then we find ourselves like old Chico here. I don't know if you can read that. Winning the lottery had changed his life, but at times Chico still felt strangely unfulfilled. Might be something about the cage, but if anything, I like The Far Side. Not everybody gets it. It's fine. It's fine. You know, if anything, it's harder to be faithful when we face prosperity than when we face adversity. As Solomon settled into his wealth and his fame, he exploited his people with forced labor and oppressive taxes. His many wives drew him away to worship other gods. And at the end of his life, he looked back on everything he had, all he had experienced, and he just said, meaningless, vanity. When facing prosperity, that's when Solomon's father David grew complacent. He abused his power, he gave in to lust, and committed adultery and murder. Just this morning, we were looking at the rich young ruler who, because of his prosperity, walked away from Jesus, unable to commit to following him. But then we have Joseph, don't we? His situation changed really quickly. One morning, he woke up as a slave in prison, but by evening, he was in the palace, one of the most powerful men in the most powerful nation on earth at the time. It was sudden, but it was a long time coming. The actor Eddie Cantor said once, "It took me 30 years to be an overnight success." And there's some truth to that. Joseph had gone through a lot. He'd experienced the betrayal of his family, 13 years as a slave. He was framed for assault. He spent more than 2 years in prison, and he was forgotten by the one person he thought could help him get free. But God was with him through all of it. And then Pharaoh has these 2 dreams. They're so vivid that he's deeply troubled. He demands an explanation. Now, he would have had a lot of counselors whose specialty was interpreting dreams. There were whole books of dream interpretation. And for some reason, they go to those and they're drawing a blank. We don't know what these mean. Sorry, Pharaoh. But then the cupbearer suddenly remembers Joseph, Joseph's ability to correctly interpret dreams, and so Pharaoh has Joseph brought from prison. And what follows? The way that we see Joseph accept this new season of prosperity. It shows us several things about how we can remain faithful to God when things are going well for us. The first thing I think we see is that we should seek God's glory and not our own. Joseph's pulled out of prison, he's cleaned up, dressed up, sent to the palace, and Pharaoh tells Joseph, "I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." You notice that Joseph immediately gives the wrong answer. "I cannot do it." I think everyone in the throne room probably held their breath at that moment. The soldiers in the wings probably tensed up. Okay, we're going to have to haul this guy out of here. What does he think he's doing? But then Joseph finished. "But God will." Literally, what Joseph says is, God will give an answer of peace to Pharaoh. Don't look to me for peace, king. You're troubled, but don't look to a man for your peace. God is the one who will give you peace. Joseph shows us that we should give credit to God. There's a great temptation to think that, well, I'll give God the credit when I make it. Until we get there, though, we need to promote ourselves. Maybe we need to keep quiet about God so we don't lose a chance to get ahead. But Joseph shows us that's not the right way to think. It's both fearful and prideful at the same time, if you really think about it. Our lives should point to God at all times, whether we're in prison or in the palace, in adversity, in prosperity, whether we've already made it or we're still standing in front of Pharaoh with our future in his hands, or so it seems. And Joseph shows us that we should be humble to do so. That doesn't mean putting ourselves down. It means being realistic about who we are, what we know, what we can do. I've heard it said many times before, humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. That really runs in the face of our culture, doesn't it? The way we're supposed to do our resumes and our LinkedIn profiles, how we're supposed to handle a job interview. It's counter to what we see in our athletes, in our politicians, in our business leaders. Once when I was in high school, one of my close friends, his father, who was also very close to me, kind of criticized me for not promoting myself more. He said, "You're going to find you need to toot your own horn." And something about that just kind of didn't sit right with me. And after a while, I thought of something. I think it was the Holy Spirit offering me this corrective. If you always toot your own horn, sooner or later, you're going to start to play off key. In Proverbs, we read, "Let someone else praise you and not your own mouth, an outsider and not your own lips." Paul writes, "For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you." I think James captures Joseph's situation very well with this direction. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. So the first thing we see from Joseph is that we need to give God the glory, not ourselves. Second, we need to pursue wisdom, not just knowledge. Joseph hears Pharaoh's dreams, and God immediately gives him the interpretation. There will be 7 years of abundant harvests, followed by 7 years of famine. That's knowledge. It's really good knowledge to have. Can you imagine knowing that the economy is going to grow for the next 7 years, and then suddenly it's going to crash and be down for 7 years before it starts to recover? That'd be really helpful knowledge to know, wouldn't it? But knowledge is worthless if we don't have wisdom. Notice how quickly Joseph moves past that information, that knowledge. He presents a plan. Pharaoh, you need to appoint an administrator. He should collect extra grain during the years of plenty, storing them up for the years of famine that are coming. And yes, Joseph was proposing that Pharaoh should raise taxes. Don't know if that changes what you think of him. According to some scholars, it probably actually doubled the tax on grain in Egypt at that time. And I don't know a lot about ancient Egyptian culture, but I do know that many ancient cultures used a lot more indirect communication than we tend to in America today. Joseph doesn't directly apply for this position that he mentions, but it's very possible that he was indirectly giving Pharaoh his RFP. Here's how I would address this problem if I were in charge. But regardless of Joseph's intent, Pharaoh does tap him for the job. Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Shows us we don't just need knowledge, we need wisdom. You've probably all heard of the Peter Principle, that people in an organization tend to get promoted until they reach a level where they're no longer competent. You've probably seen that at work. When I was younger, I read the Dilbert Principle by Scott Adams. You've probably seen this idea at work too. The least competent people in an organization are moved to the positions where they can do the least damage. Management. In contrast to these ideas, God appeared to Solomon when he first became king. He told him to ask for whatever he wanted God to give him. And Solomon replied this, "Give me wisdom and knowledge, that I may lead this people. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" When I was a bit older than Joseph at this point, about 5 years older than that, I was promoted to a vice president position at a college. That wasn't something I had sought. Honestly, I didn't particularly want it. I felt that I was in over my head. And almost every day on the drive into work, Solomon's prayer became my prayer. Lord, give me wisdom, for who is able to lead this people of yours? When God prospers us, we need both knowledge and wisdom. We need to know what is true, to have right knowledge about the situation, the people, the events around us. And boy, isn't that hard in this current cultural moment where we are. It's hard to know what's true. We're surrounded by boasting and hype and fear-mongering and outright lies. We see that at the national level. But that's really just a reflection of what we see in organizations and in personal relationships. It's hard to know what's true. So we need to ask God to help us discern what is true, what is false in the world around us. We need to use the intelligence, the resources He's given us to sort out the truth from the lies, to ask His Spirit to lead us. We need to know what is true, and we need to know what to do. Knowing the truth is important, but as Joseph shows us, we also need to know what to do in light of the truth. We need to know how to act on that right knowledge. That's wisdom. Knowing how to act in accordance with reality. Knowing how to act in accordance with God and His will. And that's a tall order. But James encourages us, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. When you prosper, ask God to give you His knowledge and His wisdom. Next, what we see in Joseph is that he worked well. Joseph was suddenly promoted to one of the highest positions in the land. Pharaoh gave him his signet ring, essentially his signature, authorizing whatever actions Joseph chose to do. He's given great authority. He gets new clothes. It's interesting, he lost his father's ornate robe to his brothers. He lost his cloak to Potiphar's wife, but now he receives royal linen robes from Pharaoh. He's given a chariot with a police escort. He never has to worry about traffic again. I see this, and I think of once when we were in Thailand. I think it was the princess, was going past, her motorcade was going past. Police appeared out of nowhere, shut down the street. We were kind of pushed back into the shops that were there, and suddenly this little city street, there was this motorcade of SUVs going by at probably 60 miles an hour. And I just kind of thought, that's kind of what Joseph was experiencing. Never worry about traffic again. Make way. Pharaoh even gives Joseph a new name. It means revealer of secrets, or God speaks through him. And Pharaoh arranges for Joseph to marry into Egyptian nobility. Notice, Joseph actually accepts the blessings of this position willingly. We do need to be humble. We need God's wisdom, but God wants his people in positions of authority and influence. Joseph didn't refuse the position. He didn't say, no, I'm too young, I'm not qualified, I'm a foreigner, I've been in prison. No, he accepted the position and its perks. He didn't refuse the ring or the gold chain. He rode in the chariot. Proverbs 29:2 says, "When the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan." If Joseph hadn't taken that position, it might have gone to somebody without his leadership, without his administrative skills, without his faithfulness. Might have gone to a wicked and selfish person, and all the people of Egypt would have suffered. If you get a promotion, if you're blessed with prosperity, don't feel guilty about that. And this is something I've struggled with. When I got that promotion at work, I was embarrassed to tell people my title, so I just avoided it. I felt guilty about my salary because I knew that there were a lot of people who didn't make as much as I did. And especially as we think about the situations with homelessness and people in difficulty coming to this country trying to get a better start, there can be a temptation to feel that way. I don't feel that way so much about my salary now, but imposter syndrome is still very much a real thing for pastors. We need to beware of pride. We need to beware of feeling like we're superior to other people because of our position, feeling like we deserve it. If we got what we deserved, we'd all be on the cross. We need to beware of flaunting our wealth, of putting our hopes and trust in riches. But if God has blessed you, give him thanks for his goodness. And look for how he wants to use you and use what he has put into your hands. How does he want to use the influence he has given you? How does he want to use your resources for his glory and to bless those around you? God blesses us for one reason, so that we can be a blessing to others. And it's never too late to start doing that. Joseph accepted his promotion willingly, but we also see that he worked hard in his new role. A lot of people face the temptation to slack off after they think they've made it, right? There's a temptation to just coast. In a previous job that I had, I knew somebody who had a pretty high-level position, but we were never entirely sure what he did. He was the brother of a prominent local figure, and it seemed that was the reason he got the job. His office was in the same building as mine, and I sat by a window, and almost every day, many times a day, I would look out the window and see him walking laps around the building, just walking laps. If he'd brought trumpets and the Ark of the Covenant, I might have started to get worried, but I never saw those. Joseph worked hard in his new role. He delegated, he appointed commissioners, but he stayed active, he stayed hands-on. He traveled throughout Egypt, checking on the progress. He made sure that everything was being done appropriately, that the grain was being stored well, that every region was doing its part to prepare for the famine. And when the famine struck, we see there was Joseph overseeing the distribution of the food. He did his work with integrity and with abundant results. If God puts you in a position of responsibility, if he prospers you, keep working hard. Develop your skills. Keep learning. Do your work thoroughly so that God will be honored by your work. One of the ways that we felt God was leading us to the organization we served with in China was because they took very seriously our witness and our teaching. They provided a lot of training, opportunities to further our education so that we could be excellent teachers at the colleges we served in China. Because if we weren't excellent teachers, anything we shared about our hope in Jesus would just fall flat. If you're going to give God the glory, and you should, make sure you're giving him glory through the way that you work, not just through your words. When I was confirmed in my home church, I received a Bible. And inside the front cover of that Bible, the presiding elder, who happened to be my dad, he wrote this for all of us: read daily 2 Timothy 2:15. Be diligent to present yourself worthy to God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. That was the translation that I had. This is the NIV. Be diligent. Work hard. Work well. And don't forget God. Joseph, notice what he named his sons. He named his firstborn Manasseh, which sounds like the Hebrew for forget. Kind of an odd thing to go through life, being named forget. He named his second son Ephraim, which sounds like twice fruitful. He said, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household, and God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. You know, it's interesting. Joseph said he forgot, but it's clear that he didn't. He wasn't denying his pain, but he was able to move past it. He wasn't denying his family, but he was able to forgive. Joseph remembered God. He remembered who had given him everything that he had. One of the greatest temptations when things are going well is that we get distracted. That new position means that work starts taking up more of our time. You have money to travel on the weekends maybe, so you do. And you find life getting so busy that it starts to crowd out God. And you tell yourself, or tell the pastor, this is just a season. We're going to get back to church in the fall, or next year, or once the business gets off the ground, once we get through the merger, or maybe what's most painful to hear, once the kids graduate. You find that your social group starts to become the people who make the same that you do, who go on the same trips that you do, who have a similar house and the same cars, but not necessarily the same values you once had. And you find that your spiritual resources are depleted. You're wide open to temptation. Or maybe even worse, you find you're no longer a target for Satan's attacks because you're no longer a threat. Don't let prosperity distract you from God. And look for opportunities to point other people to him. It's interesting to me that Joseph married an Egyptian woman, the daughter of a pagan priest. Later on, the people of Israel were going to be told not to intermarry with those who followed other gods because their spouses would lead them away from the true God. And that's what gave Solomon so much trouble. But there's no evidence that Joseph was unfaithful to God. There's no evidence that he was unfaithful to his Egyptian wife either. Instead, it seems that he was the spiritual leader in his family. He pointed them to the God he had come to know in adversity and in prosperity. Notice his sons' names, Manasseh and Ephraim. Those are Hebrew names. They're not Egyptian names. Every time he introduced his boys to somebody, I'm sure it led to a conversation about their names. I've never heard that name before. Where did it come from? What does it mean? It was an opportunity to point other people to God and to his faithfulness. When God blesses you with prosperity, it's good and proper to say, God has been good to me. We need people in positions of influence who aren't ashamed of their faith, who are willing to work for God's justice and his glory, who will point others to God through their words and through their work. One last thing, Pastor Jeff shared this picture when he was talking about this passage, and I think it's a good one. Who here has played Monopoly? Everybody, I'm sure. Has anybody ever played a game of Monopoly all the way to the end? I might have once or twice. Usually the board just gets overturned and somebody storms off. But when you play Monopoly, what do? You go around collecting properties and houses and hotels and collecting rent hour after hour after hour until somebody goes bankrupt. And then what happens? They're out of the game. So they get up and leave the table. And then someone else goes bankrupt, and they get up and leave the table. And finally, somebody wins. And maybe it's even you. Great. But then what happens? You're sitting at the table by yourself, and you get to put all the pieces back in the box. That's it. At the end of your life, what does your prosperity amount to? At the end of our lives, we go back in the box. At the end of our lives, we are all going to face God. And he's going to ask, did you know Christ? Did you follow him? Did you work with eternity in mind? Did you use what I gave you to bless others? Whose glory did you work for? Whether we have much or little, I pray that we'll learn from Joseph to be faithful.